don't know what I'm doing!
Well, this is it. Excuse me.
A thought that may have terrified the 1930s. Now it's recognized as a quick, clean, comfortable way to cross oceans and continents. Less than 3.5 hours from the runways of London's Heathrow, Manhattan's famous skyline lifts out of the ocean.
The reason being that it was a delta wing design and it had a very high angle of attack on landing. So in order to see, they were able to lower the nose.
We're actually flying at twice the speed of sound, to be precise, 1,341 miles per hour, 11 miles up. And this is how smooth it can be, at more than twice the speed of sound.
With the skies clear to New York for supersonic flight, it's felt the rest of the world will go Concorde.
This is the story of an aeroplane that doesn't exist. If it flies, well, flying in it will be like putting Granny in a missile, just 7 years from now.
In order to properly tell this story, we're going to need to go back to a time in the late 1950s that most people refer to as the Jet Age. You see, around this time, jet engines, which were developed during World War II, were starting to be used in commercial airliners. Specifically airliners like the de Havilland Comet in 707, which were quickly changing the landscape of civil transportation. And as most people thought back then, if air transport was getting faster, it wasn't going to be too long before supersonic air travel became a reality. This type of thinking could really only exist during this era, as not only had World War II just ended, but the Cold War was in its infancy, so every technological advancement was really more of a propaganda victory than anything else, no matter which side achieved it. So both the West and the Soviet Union were very interested early on in creating the SST, or supersonic transport. By the time the 1960s rolled around, most developed countries were interested in creating their own model, including one from Canada that I can't find too much information on. But by far the one that was the most promising was the American design. You see, after they had launched a competition between several American companies, including Lockheed and Boeing and North American, it was decided that the Boeing design, their 2707, was the most promising. It was meant to be the biggest and fastest commercial airliner that could ever be built. And unfortunately, that ended up tying them up, and, well, we'll get back to that one later. While both countries worked on their respective designs, with the French Super Caravelle and the British Type 223, they both realized that the designs were so similar that potential federal funding for a single project with both countries would be more likely to succeed.
At Lancaster House, the aviation minister, Mr. Julian Amery, in company with the French ambassador, almost crooned in admiration over the brainchild of their two countries. On behalf of their governments, they signed the agreement for the joint development and production.
Unlike their engineers, the politicians did fall out. Harold Wilson was furious with President de Gaulle for adding a letter E to the word Concorde, so he removed it. But de Gaulle put it back. In Bristol and Toulouse, the workers didn't give a flying fig.
Why is it a material? Or some say Concorde, some say Concorde, so I don't think it makes any difference at all.
So once the controversy with the name was figured out, and each side learned the other's language, they decided to work on two models, one in France and one in Britain. These would be ultimately the same design, however, there would be one key flaw that would come back to bite them in the end. February of 1969, the French model rolled out onto the runway in Toulouse, France, and took flight for the very first time. During 1973, Concorde made history by having scientists on board observe a total eclipse that year, much longer than had ever been previously possible. Due to the Concorde's speed, scientists were able to observe the eclipse for hours on end. Meanwhile, back in America, things weren't running so smoothly. Seattle had just released their 747 project, but that wasn't the main concern of the company at the time. Their main priority was to work on the 2707, which was still in development. In fact, a model of the aircraft hadn't even been built. Well, that's not entirely true, actually. A scale model of the aircraft had been built, but the real thing was still on paper. They ran into a lot of problems, mainly because of the high demands that they decided to go for with the aircraft. Flying it at Mach 3 instead of Mach 2 proved to be too difficult, and carrying 300 passengers just wasn't viable. Overall, the aircraft was just way too complicated and way ahead of its time, to the point where it couldn't even be built, probably even today.
On May the 18th, 1971, the United States Senate met to vote on a motion to end funding the SST project. President Nixon had worked hard to persuade the senators to keep on with the project, but without success. The Senate voted 58 to 37 to kill the Boeing 2707.
When Concorde first flew in 1969, the aircraft had 74 orders from 16 different airlines. But by 1976, when the aircraft entered service, every single one of those orders had been dropped. Airlines simply decided that it was no longer profitable to operate the aircraft. And with an oil crisis in the early 1970s, that made sense.
The French and British governments had one last option: to sell Concorde to their own national airlines. But with empty sales books, they smelt a bargain.
I had to deal with British Airways, and there is not the slightest doubt they screwed me to the floorboards. I mean, basically, we gave it to them.
One thing I should mention is that in the 1960s, most countries had banned supersonic flight over land. Primarily the United States, which is one of the major things that killed the American project. This meant that Concorde couldn't fly supersonic over land. And the reason for this is the sonic boom. Every time an aircraft flies supersonic over land, there is a loud bang heard on the ground. So for Concorde, there would be no New York to Los Angeles routes. It would only be transatlantic, which had limited options. So by the time the 1980s rolled around, Concorde was a successful airliner and one of the most advanced technological achievements mankind had ever invented. But why do I feel like I'm missing something? Of course the Russians were involved in this! It was the Cold War! What do you think it was? Actually, now that I think about it, Russia's pretty much involved in everything. But the point is, of course Russia had a design. The Soviet Union knew how important the SST project was to the West. They wanted to prove that they could make a bigger, better, and more importantly, faster version. So the Soviet Union funded the development of the Tupolev Tu-144, or as the Western media called it, the Konkordsky. One thing that the Russians did do right is they flew their aircraft first. On December 31st, 1969, 2 months before the British and French versions, Konkordsky took to the sky. However, it was not the prestigious aircraft that England and France had worked on. It was loud. Also, it only flew to one destination in Kazakhstan. Konkordsky also had one of the most shoddy safety records of any aircraft ever built. And even still, there were several crashes. Most notably at the Paris Air Show in 1973, when one simply disintegrated in mid-air. So with the American version dead and the Soviet version cancelled, this left the Anglo-French design as the only SST that was in the skies. And for the next 2 decades, it was smooth sailing.
British Airways Concorde, you are clear for takeoff.
Last year, more international passengers chose to fly with British Airways than with any other airline. In fact, last year, British Airways planes travelled over 150 million miles. That's further than from Earth to Mars and back. British Airways, the world's favourite airline.
I don't particularly like talking about tragedies on my channel. I try to keep things fairly light. But unfortunately, with Concorde, this is unavoidable.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. It has been quite a day. We'll get to the Middle East peace talks and the running mate for Governor Bush, but for the first time in more than 30 years in its history, a Concorde has crashed, and that's where we start. It was an Air France Concorde chartered by a German tour company. It had just taken off from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris when something cataclysmic happened in at least one of the 4 engines. In this picture, you can see a long stream of smoke and fire as the pilot struggled to gain altitude. He failed. And when the plane crashed in the grounds of a small rural hotel in Gonesse, just outside Paris, 100 passengers, mostly German, 1 American, 9 crew, all French, and 4 people on the ground were killed.
In July of 2000, a Concorde crashed in Paris, France. The crash was ultimately not Concorde's fault, as a trial years later would prove. Unfortunately, that trial occurred years after Concorde would be retired. The crash was caused by a piece of metal on the runway which ruptured one of the Concorde's tires, which ultimately led to a ruptured fuel tank and a fire and one of the most devastating disasters in European history. Shortly after the crash, all Concordes were grounded for both British Airways and Air France while they figured out what caused the accident. And after the cause was determined, Concordes were refitted to prevent that kind of crash ever again. When the Concorde relaunched, it was arguably the safest airliner in the sky. Heck, it was arguably the safest airliner in the sky before the crash. It was just a freak event, and ultimately Murphy's Law. British Airways decided to launch a test flight before they actually entered their aircraft into service again, about a year after the disaster. The test flight was for them to fly supersonic, turn around, and then fly right back to London, instead of going to New York. It would prove to be an eerily good decision that the aircraft didn't go to New York that day, as the test flight took place on a Tuesday morning in September of 2001.
And we got off the airplane, and my mobile phone rang. And it was my youngest son. He was saying, "Dad, have you heard what's happened in New York?"
And we had landed back at Heathrow just before the first airplane crashed into the World Trade Center.
And then my son said, "Oh my God, an airplane's hit the other tower."
A major problem with flying an aircraft like the Concorde is you're exclusively serving rich people in highly populated areas, primarily cities like New York. And in cities like New York, all the rich people tend to work in the same place. So, after 9/11, a good portion of Concorde's clientele was no longer available to fly the aircraft. Concorde's only route was to New York, and New York had fundamentally changed.
Now to Concorde's last flight. BA Flight 002 from New York touched down at just after 4 this afternoon. It was the last of 3 Concordes to land at Heathrow today, ending one of the most glittering achievements in aviation history, supersonic passenger travel. At the airport, there were cheers, tears, and of course, that familiar deafening roar.
And that's it. There's no comeback, there's no return flights, there's nothing. It's so interesting to see technology and humanity move backwards. Civil air transportation had gone from 600 miles per hour to over twice the speed of sound, and then went back. For years, that's where the story ended. However, not recently.
But the reality is that's what it takes. So that's what we decided to take on at my company, Boom. We started working on this seriously about 3 years ago, on the first new supersonic airliner in 50 years. And I'm so proud. We've completed the design of the first prototype. And we're about 18 months away from flying it right here in Denver. So the prototype is little, but here's the first production aircraft, the boom jet. It seats 55 people. It will take you from New York to London in time to make an afternoon meeting and home in time to tuck your children into bed.
For the first time in what seemed like years, it actually truly feels like there might be supersonic transportation ahead in the near future. I might look out my window and see an actual SST landing at my airport one day. And I hope that happens. I really do. But with that, my name's Jeremy. I don't know what I'm doing. Sorry it took so long to upload another video. And I will leave you with this.
14 years after the Concorde was grounded, private companies are on the verge of bringing supersonic air travel back. And this time, it'll be built to last. Boom Technologies aircraft will mainly fly over water, and the company has devised a new form factor, a 3-engine jet that can carry up to 55 passengers and flies more than twice the speed of sound, cutting transatlantic travel times nearly in half. And while a ticket for the Concorde would originally set you back about $15,000 in today's dollars, Boom expects to charge $5,000 round trip from London to New York.